Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ben Sharma, the founder and CEO of Zaloni. So today we'll cover what does an enterprise data lake in the cloud look like. So I have the pleasure of having Selwyn Collaco with me. He's the Chief Data Officer of Toronto Stock Exchange, TMX Group. So I'll hand it over to him in a moment. So what we'll cover is their journey in terms of their data strategy and how they went about it. And then I'll take over and talk about what are some of the architectural patterns you need to think about. How do you manage an end-to-end cloud-based enterprise data lake from a governance and data management perspective, right? So with that, I'll hand it over to Selwyn so that he can introduce himself and talk about their journey with their data lake architecture. Thanks, Selwyn.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. So Selwyn Collaco, Chief Data Officer of TMX Group. So I've been at TMX for about 15 months now. Sounds larger when I say 15 months rather than a year. But having said that, what I wanted to bring to you, I don't think everybody knows what TMX is. So TMX Group consists of different companies, such as the Toronto Stock Exchange, the Montreal Stock Exchange, the Venture Exchange. We also do all the clearing of derivatives and equity trades in Canada, so the clearing and settlement divisions as well. So in other words, we are the nucleus of Canada's capital markets. Now, the reason they hired a chief data officer was more because to not just introduce governance from a data perspective, but also take data to the next level. And what I mean data to the next level, today TMX monetizes data. So we have a business that generates about $140 million in revenue from just data, from monetization. But the next wave is about taking that data to an enterprise, as an enterprise asset. So all these businesses that I spoke to you about have been acquired over the years. So there was not organic growth in terms of how the business evolved, so there were acquisitions. So data resides in the multiple silos of these businesses. So there is value in each of these business units, but our strategy was to bring this data together to create more inherent value, more from not from a raw format perspective, but from an analytics perspective. So our strategy at TMX, we kept it very simple to start off with. So what I'm going to do here is talk about an actual use case from inception to implementation. So I'm going to try to get that done in 10 minutes. It took us, and the context to this is about selection of the right product, right vendor, but also the speed to market and the focus on business value rather than technology for the sake of technology. So our strategy was to pretty much unlock the business value in our data in the different silos across the organization, to create business value internally, to enable businesses within the organization, but also enable growth, so create more revenue. So we kept it simple in terms of what are the three areas that we want to focus on. So we wanted a consolidated data asset across the enterprise. We wanted to make sure our data is secure and accessible internally and externally. And we want to make sure we have the right tools from an analytics and visualization perspective. So these were the 5 foundational enablers that we put in place to deliver the strategy. The first one was about delivering enhanced business value in terms of, so we kept our focus on business use cases. What are the use cases that we want to deliver and execute upon to the enterprise data strategy? So we focused on data, specific use cases, focused on synergies across the different data sets and different businesses. And we kept the eye on what are the monetization strategies that we want to focus on once this enterprise platform has been built. Modernization of data assets. So we had a lot of historical data, as some of you may already have data sitting on tapes from a historical perspective. So our mandate was to move away from those backup tapes and have them accessible easily so we can monetize them further or leverage it further to enhance it with either existing data sets, derived or alternate data. The third one was obviously we want to make sure the data is consumed. So that's where the value is demonstrated in terms, yes, you've ingested the data, you've curated it, you've had derived sets, you've augmented it with alternate data, but how do you access it? So the right tools and capabilities were key from a consumption perspective. The fourth one is about the enterprise data platform and MDM capability. So we also want to understand our customer wealth in terms of 360 perspective. So all these businesses onboarded customers separately as part of the operations. So there was no one centralized onboarding team. the different business units and different ways they do business. So what we did was we implemented something called Customer 360 MDM from Informatica. I can get into the tools later, but we've got our data integrated with Salesforce from a CRM perspective, created a 360 view of the customer. And then we wanted to build out an enterprise data platform. So we're a cloud-first strategy organization. So we landed on, obviously, Zaloni as our enterprise data management solution, lake solution. And number 5 was governance, which is key to keeping all these components together. So update on the journey, I kind of quickly touched on it. So we implemented Customer 360, Tableau as a BI tool internally. We introduced a product called ThoughtSpot as analytics as a service. We are also integrating it within our product base in some of our product e-commerce offerings that we have. And then we selected Zaloni as the enterprise data lake platform from a management perspective. Now, and the last one you see which is horizontal, data governance. So data governance was more about enabling the organization in terms of how do we classify our data, what's the privacy rules around the data sets. So we have public data, we have private data, so that's very a strict policy in place to make sure our data is not is kept secure. Now all this, we started this work sometime in last July. Today, we are well live with all these components in the organization. Now, you may ask me how large my team is when I started at the organization. So one thing is I have a unique role as the Chief Data Officer. I have the data governance aspect of it, but I have technology delivery responsibilities as well. And as of today, I have the analytics monetization responsibilities and how do we monetize analytics at TMX. So it's a very unique role, but it's fun as well because you get to control your destiny as well in terms of rather than influencing my technology partners, I can deliver the technology at a much faster pace as well because I'm responsible for the end state. Having said that, from a Zaloni perspective, I think I'll tell you the process we went through, but just to give you from a speed to time to market perspective, we signed the contract sometime in December last year. We were in production end of February, literally. So next, this is a sort of a graphical view of what the end state is going to be looks like at TMX. So the left side represents all the different TMX assets that we have from the different lines of businesses. That's our data lake, the enterprise, we call it the EDP, Enterprise Data Platform. It's powered by Zaloni. It sits on AWS, Amazon Web Services. And the right side is more on the consumption side of the fence in terms of the various analytics that we provide to the data that we ingest into the Zaloni product. Now, governance. So this was another very unique experience in how we implemented governance at TMX. And I call it a non-invasive governance, so not that we went through some specific methodology, but what we did was we kept the business value ahead of us rather than talking about data governance as a framework or as a big enterprise project with the different businesses. We spoke about what were the key challenges around data that they encountered on a day-to-day basis. So we spoke about the lack of data ownership, the data accessibility and security issues, the duplication of data. So we came up with a lot of list of challenges. And then we spoke about what was the business value we want to create from the data. But we used governance from a classification ownership perspective as a wrapper to solving those business challenges. So we didn't really say, okay, we are going to look at every asset one by one and start fixing those issues because that will take us for 10 years if you start doing that. So we took a very pragmatic, realistic approach, but more focused on the business value we want to create for the business. So and then we all, in order to do that, we also classified or categorized our data sets under different domains. And what we did, the first thing we did was we built a data catalog of all the data assets. And we categorize them under those domains. So that way you can have a more intelligent discussion with the business units. So then we established the governance councils at the enterprise level. We established a working group committee. So now we have a standing cadence in terms of making sure we govern. But when we get into this governance discussions, we talk about the business value that's been created in the last few months rather than talking about which data assets should we govern. So going back to the technology stack, technology platform, we sit on AWS, so we are on the cloud. From a big data distribution perspective, we use EMR or AWS, and Zaloni was the data lake management solution that we selected. And when we went to the selection process, we did look at other vendors as well, and I think. I shouldn't say this loud, but Ben, I think we took a big risk. We were the first. I think we were the first client in Canada for Zaloni.
That's correct.
So you're privileged to have us as a client. So having said that, but there were other vendors as well that we assessed, and they were. I think Zaloni was just 5 years old in the market at that time. The others were much more established, but we realized the big data world, the Hadoop ecosystem keeps evolving every 3 to 6 months. It's not a static world. So we went with a product that's fully managed in a sense, fully integrated from an ingestion to data governance perspective. So we have the two products within Zaloni, Bedrock and Mica. So one does the ingestion, the other provides the data governance capability in terms of metadata management, lineage, the cataloging aspect as well in terms of the business metadata. So 8 months now into the journey, I think we've had some challenges in terms of not directly related to Zaloni, but in terms of how you size up the environment for what purpose. So the concept of nodes for compute. One of the things I think we went short on is we went with a single node with the Bedrock instance, for example. So we just had to increase the number of nodes to increase the compute power. That was one experience that we had. The second one, I would say the good was to get our journey, keep our journey accelerated, we actually use the Zaloni resources to actually ingest the data first. And the reason was, obviously, I didn't have a team, as I said. I had 5 people in my team in total to do all this work. And we did it with 5 people. But what we did was we partnered with key partners and vendors to accelerate that journey because they did it as their bread and butter. And we were not in that business. So it made sense to get us to a mature level and then start building the team. And one of the advantages with Zaloni was from a training perspective, I was able to now pull resources who were into database management from the organization into my team and train them with Zaloni, and it took them just a couple of weeks to get up to speed. These guys were not even big data experts. They didn't know anything about big data. So the learning curve was minimal from that perspective, and I think today we have a team, pretty much we have a team of about 7 people staffed up and trained to work on Zaloni, and we're still using, in some cases, where Zaloni, from an design and architecture perspective, Zaloni resources. So far the journey has been a positive start, but the end game is for us to build out our analytics platform, which is coming after this. So we focused on the foundation. We said, let's get the foundation right. We didn't want to focus on AI, machine learning, all this. That's great, but we kept it simple. We said, let's build the foundation and then start looking at how can we leverage this data to the next level. On that note, I think the Q&A is later, Ben.
Yeah.
So I'm going to hand it over to Ben. Thank you.
Thanks, Selwyn. All right, so what I'll then cover now is how do you go about thinking about this data lake architecture, especially in a cloud-based environment. So there is a lot of noise in this space, right? So this is a slide we use where you see all the vendors in this space and also what analysts are coming up with new terms, whether it's data lake, data fabric, data hub, and things like that. But from our perspective, typically when you're trying to build a self-service data platform, there are 4 things that are important. So the first thing is you need to think from an agnostic standpoint, whether you're deploying this in one environment or multiple environments, in on-prem or in the cloud or in multi-cloud. You need to think about it from a strong metadata perspective. So you have heard this term called data is the new oil. From our perspective, metadata is the new oil. So without metadata, there is no value of the data. There is no governance model that you can put together. So you need to think about how do you use metadata to make the data useful for your data consumers and also to enforce the governance policies that you need to. The third thing that is key to this is being able to automate your data pipelines. So that is for efficiency as well as for scale. And at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is provide these as self-service capabilities so that your data consumers are able to shorten the time to insight and be able to get value out of the data platform. So that's kind of, at a high level, what are some of the requirements that we see in this space. Now, as you may be thinking about your data lake journey, you may be in various different stages. So we have customers who don't have a data lake yet. They are typically in a data warehouse environment. So they are thinking about a modernization approach where they are actually trying to build a modern data platform based on a data lake. So what are some of the things that you need to think about? Then customers who may have actually onboarded these platforms, but they haven't put together the right architecture, and thereby they have created what we call a data swamp, right? Without the proper metadata, without the governance models and things like that. So they're being able to create a governance model, being able to manage this data as an asset, being able to have metadata around it, thinking about data quality, thinking about data profiling. So those kind of issues are critical as you build this data platform out. And then the third category we see is that people who have actually built a governed data lake, so they have thought through these capabilities. So what they're trying to do is provide better self-service capabilities, better features for their data consumers so that they are able to take advantage of what they have built as a platform and take it forward for generating insights in a much shorter time frame. So as we think about this, we typically use a reference architecture, and I'm no way saying that this is the only way you should do it, but we think about it from a zone-based architecture. So you think about your data lake in different zones where you're bringing in your raw data from source systems, landing it through a transient landing zone, which may be optional. Some of our customers who have specific security requirements, they may want to mask and tokenize the data before they make it consumable, thereby having the need for a transient landing zone. But typically what we see is that there is a raw zone created, and the raw zone is where your data resides in the same format as the original source systems. And you keep all the history of the data in the raw zone. And then being able to apply some of the governance policies, being able to apply data quality rules so that now you're creating trusted and validated data sets that you're publishing in what we call the trusted zone, right? So these are typically done by a centralized data authority within an organization where there are SMEs who are defining critical data elements in a standardized way, and they're validating that based on the incoming data so that you're creating the trusted zone. And then we think about the refined zone, which is where you're creating line of business or use case specific data sets, but you're publishing them back to the rest of the organization because they may be of use. And then last but not least is the sandbox zone, which is equally important because ultimately what you're trying to enable is agility with data and analytics. So how do you enable experimentation and ad hoc exploratory analytics within this data lake environment? So being able to create sandboxes for your data science or data consumers so that they can try out various things and build the models is important. So this is kind of a typical reference architecture that we use from a data lake deployment perspective. Now, as we think about an integrated approach from ingestion to consumption that covers the supply chain of data, we think of it in three main pillars. So the first pillar is how do you enable the data lake, which means how do you ingest data from various sources, how do you capture the metadata, how do you auto-discover some of those attributes for data that already may be residing in the environment, because not every environment will be a greenfield. You may have ingested and you may have a brownfield type of deployment model. So how do you auto-discover and capture some of the metadata? So once you have figured out how to bring in data and how to capture metadata as part of ingestion or as part of being able to discover it, then we think about the governance pillar. So now how do you govern the data that is in the data lake? So that includes being able to check for data quality, because that is an often ignored function in this new world of doing things. So how do you check for data? Because it's schema on read, right? So you don't specify schema when you write the data. So you may have garbage, and if you're trying to build some downstream applications, you don't want a garbage in, garbage out. So how do you check for data quality, separate good records from bad records? How do you maintain lineage as you may be transforming the data, because a lot of these use cases are used for regulatory compliance requirements where you have to actually generate outcomes for your downstream use cases, and you need to have full visibility of the lineage and auditability of the data. The other thing that we're seeing more and more is being able to do data mastering in the data lake. So now you're bringing in data from various different sources. How do you create your single view of customer, single view of patient, single view of product, single view of security are some of the use cases that we see in this space. Now, one of the big concerns as you onboard into a cloud-based data lake environment is privacy and security. You want to make sure sensitive data is masked and tokenized as you think about onboarding these data sets and making them available for your downstream consumers. And then data enrichment and data lifecycle management kind of fall into that governance pillar. So now that you have figured out how to bring in the data, how to govern the data, the third pillar we focus on is how do you engage your data consumers? How do you engage your stakeholders? Because ultimately it's about the business value, right? How do you enable this self-service capability with a data marketplace and enable some of these self-service provisioning capabilities where you're able to select data almost in a shopping cart experience, add them to a shopping cart, and be able to provision a sandbox so that you can do your ad hoc exploratory analytics in that platform. And as you think about these set of features, it should be agnostic, where you may be on-prem, you may be in the cloud, you may be in multi-cloud. So how do you do that across these different properties that you may have as you onboard into a data lake strategy? So these are some of the core features enabling the data lake with scale-out ingestion. So we use a very microservices-based architecture where we can scale it out based on the volume of incoming data, and then being able to inventory the data in an automated way with a robust workflow and orchestration layer. Then we think about the governance pillar with metadata management, data quality, data lifecycle management. So this is an area that's getting more and more traction. So as your volumes of data grow, not all data is of equal value, right? So some data may be of high value because this is recent data and you need to keep it in a tier where you can access it quickly, you can provide analytics out of this data sets quickly. But you may have a lot of historical data, which you may want to keep it in a tier that is more cost effective, because that is the volume that you're dealing with. So thinking about a policy-based approach for data lifecycle management, where you're using aging policy or whatever makes sense to be able to drive that, is very important. Security and access control I talked about, so masking and tokenization of sensitive data. And then role-based access control. And especially it's very important to think about it from a cloud perspective. So when you're going to the cloud, let's say in AWS, you're using IAM as the underlying authentication and access mechanism. So how does now the data management layer, where you're talking about artifacts that needs to be made available to the marketing team or to the risk team or to the finance team, map to that security layer so that you have full end-to-end role-based access control on that data from a governance perspective is very important. And then data enrichment, where you're able to create new data sets for use case specific requirements out of raw data set, is important. So at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is provide a data marketplace so that customers can come in, data consumers can come in and search for this data. They can find out quality of the data, profile of the data, recency of the data, so that they can trust this data set. They can look at the data sets in different zones. So you may have data sets from the raw zone and the trusted zone and the refined zone being available to a user. And then being able to use those data sets, once you find the data, being able to use those data sets for your downstream use cases, whether you're trying to provision a sandbox or create something like a report or an analytics model on top of it, is important. So just to kind of talk about AWS specifically, as Selwyn and his team kind of onboarded into that platform, what does that look like from a component standpoint in terms of different layers, if you will, where you have on the left-hand side various sources that may be coming into the platform, whether They're from on-prem databases or files that may be coming in from on-prem sources, as well as third-party sources or streams, which we are seeing more and more. And then maybe you're bringing in data from third-party SaaS environments that are cloud-based, like Salesforce.com or Marketo and other things. So the way we think about it is an ingestion layer that can scale and bring in the data from various different sources. And then you need to think about, like, what does your storage layer looks like, whether you're storing the data in S3 or EFS and Glacier as you kind of age that data out. What does the processing layer looks like in terms of various processing components? And then think about the serving layer so that you're able to provide the data to the data consumers. And then the consumption layer with the machine learning and BI tools that you're bringing in. And then on the right-hand side, what we're showing is the data management and governance piece, which goes across these different layers. So what does that look like with our ZDP platform? So this is a much more detailed view of what a solution architecture looks like. So if you think about your VPC, you have Active Directory integration from a security standpoint. You have various databases from where you're bringing in the data sets and files maybe landing in a storage gateway. And streams coming in through, say, Kinesis or Kinesis Firehose into AWS buckets. So if you look at the storage layer, so we think about the storage buckets mapped to these different zones that I talked about. So the raw zone, the landing zone if you need to have a landing zone, and then the raw zone, trusted zone, refined zone, and the sandbox zone. And then being able to integrate with some of the AWS native services. So one of the things to keep in mind is that when you're building a cloud-based data lake, you need to think about how do you take advantage of the native services that the cloud service provider is bringing to you, right? So it's not a lift and shift model of what you were doing on-prem and bringing it into the cloud. It is taking advantage of these native services so that you can get the elasticity, you can get the scale-out architecture that you can that is provided from these cloud service providers. So using EMR to process the data, being able to query the data through Athena or various other services, and then being able to serve it through Redshift so that you have like Tableau, Kibana, QuickSight, or whatever your choice of BI tools to be able to access it is kind of at a high level view of how we think about it. So that's kind of the core of what I wanted to talk about. We have a few minutes. I think we can take questions. Yeah, question.
On security separation, are you doing file level security, or are you separating? For security purposes, sorry. For security, it's like, are you creating separate security zones, or are you doing the file or object level security?
So we typically, so depending on the use case, but typically what we see is that security controls at the object level, because ultimately the unit of storage in S3 is an object, right? So how do you have object level security where you're pushing down IAM policies? So let's say your marketing team needs to have access to these 6 different data sets, which manifest as artifacts in our platform. And we have this multi-tenancy approach where you can say that, okay, marketing team maps to this AD group or LDAP group, has access to, thereby has access to these data sets, and then we push it down so that ultimately whatever objects it resolves to are protected based on access that needs to be granted to those users.
That makes sense. Though it's like, I'm just for cleanliness, it's like where you want to enable, let's say, innovation, and it's like, I think you were showing through your tool set how they can basically go and, like a marketplace, pick data objects and whatnot, and load them into their market and get a workspace to play with.
Sure.
Right. So, I guess it's like, do you have a way of, let's say, anonymizing the security sensitive data so that they can use it as part of their data set for doing discovery and experimental models and so forth?
Sure.
Is that built into the
so we have
tool?
a metadata based approach. So when we get the metadata about a data set, So at the field level, you can specify certain attributes that are sensitive, and you can actually say whether you want to mask them, like a credit card number. You may want to mask the first 12 digits, but keep the last 4 digits, for example.
Right.
And similarly, we support tokenization of various SHA-based algorithms or integrate with some of the external security providers.
And that would, let's say, names and personal sensitive information, as well as whatever,
right,
whether it's financial or whatnot. But you still have fundamentally a sample of that kind of object to use.
That's right, and then being format preserving, so that basically you can do things downstream that make sense. So those are some of the things that we do out of the box. Yep. Questions?
I know. Your power users, do you allow them to access the data in the raw zone? We have a conformed zone. We have the raw, and then we also have a conformed, and then we have a fit for purpose. Do you allow your power user to access the raw zone, or do you just allow them to access the conformed zone where you've already standardized the model, eliminated all the duplicates?
So it really depends on the use case. So data scientists may want to use the data in the raw zone because they don't want the attributes to be filtered, right, or kind of already cleaned up. But Selwyn, I think from your perspective,
the data science group uses the raw zone, but the end users, the consumers, don't have the raw access.
That's what we're doing. So we're not allowing the power user from the lines of businesses to access the raw zone. We're telling them to go and access the data in the conform zone. So we have the enterprise customer model, the enterprise product model,
sure,
and then we just keep augmenting those models. So otherwise they're going to have, I feel there's going to be more confusion if they start accessing the raw, like, what is this? And
Yeah, but I think the important point here is that you have the data in the raw zone. You're not trimming any attributes, so that if you at some point of time need to go back to the original data set, you're still able to do that, which is not typically the model in an enterprise data warehouse, because you would trim those attributes out so that by the time you get to the data mart, you lose the original fidelity of the data, so that if you need to run a new use case where you need certain attributes that are not part of the data mart model, you don't have access to it. So that's kind of the right approach to think about. So, yeah.
Question. Do you enable data transformations within your platform? And if so, like end user, like self-service type transformations?
Yeah, so basically what we support is the relational functions that are built out. So think about our platform, and the design philosophy that we have taken is that we leverage the underlying data layers, right? So we would leverage Spark and kind of whatever other properties or other ecosystem properties are. So what we would do is push it down to Spark. So the operators that are supported in Spark, we would actually have a drag and drop interface so that you can actually, based on metadata, you can say, I want to join a customer data set with a transaction data set, and you're not writing any code, where we know that what's the metadata of the customer data set, we know what's the metadata of the transaction data set, what's the join key. So you select the join key, and then we create the refined data set. And then we would, and I'm just giving you a simplified example, right, and we would then push it down to a Spark execution engine, which will actually execute that in the cluster. Okay. And then we also enable power users or developers, if they have written their own jobs and their own Python scripts or MapReduce jobs, to be able to plug that into an end-to-end pipeline, so that it's, at the end of the day, it's a managed pipeline, and we can maintain the lineage of what happened, even though they're using some custom code to be able to do things.
Okay.
So you're storing the data in Parquet or Avro forms in your data lake?
Yeah, so basically what we do is provide the flexibility. So whether it's ORC or Parquet or Avro, because as part of the pipeline, we allow you to bring in your regular data. I mean, we support various different formats, whether it's coming in as CSV or JSON, or even like in some cases, our customers ingest EBCDIC data from mainframes. So being able to parse some of those formats and then generate the output, and in there you can specify whether you want to save it in the what's the target form, so that it's more efficient for the type of queries that you want to do and how you want to use the data.
Okay, and do you support CDC? So there's a change happens in the source.
Yeah. So that's an interesting question, right? So I mean, a lot of the queries that we get is, how do you support CDC? So we are not parsing Oracle redo log files to figure out what the transactions are. I mean, we can parse log miner tables to figure out like what change records were written. We can query the source databases if you have certain columns populated to periodically figure out the change records and bring them into the data lake. But what we do more importantly is merge those changed records with the historical records that you have in the data lake in an intelligent manner. So we maintain some intelligent indexes to figure out. So let's say if you have 1 billion records in the data lake and you're bringing in 10,000 records that changed, you're not scanning the whole 1 billion records, so we're doing it in a smarter way. So that's kind of the core of what we do from a CDC standpoint.
Okay, thank you.
I have two questions. One is that, is there any specific metadata management tool you used?
So the approach we have taken is that we want to integrate with the ecosystem frameworks, right? So whatever metadata that we capture or store, the technical metadata, we push it down to HCatalog metadata service, or in AWS, we integrate with Glue, for example, so that if you're using Athena or whatever AWS properties, you see the same structures and tables that you see in our platform. In addition to that, we maintain a lot of business metadata and operational metadata, right? So business attributes that you can bring in from, let's say, a business glossary that you may have. And then we capture a lot of operational metadata in terms of data quality metrics, lineage, data profile information, and things like that. So what we have done is we have a metadata exchange framework. So we provide all of that metadata through a REST API so that you can consume it. And then we also have connectors for things like IBM Information Governance Catalog or Collibra so that we can exchange metadata in a two-way sync.
So second question on the streaming. So you mentioned that it works with the streams. So so what are the streams it works with? And have you done any work on reading the database logs and stream it as a stream like Kafka or putting into the lake that way?
Yeah, so we integrate with Kafka natively. So we actually have in-memory pipeline creation as well, so that you can read from Kafka topics, execute Spark streaming jobs, so that you can actually do it in microbatch and then put it back into new Kafka topics or kind of updated Kafka topics. And then also integrating with Kinesis, Firehose, writing data into S3 buckets, and in Azure, Event Hub is something that we support. Now, in terms of reading CDC logs, so we do not read Oracle redo logs, but if you have something that is reading Oracle logs and putting it into Kafka topics, so then we can consume from there and then bring it on to the data lake and do the further processing of those records.
Thank you.
One more question?
I think we have a couple of them in front.
I know you touched upon this, but can you elaborate a little more on data lineage, how you capture lineage between these hops and if it is readily and visually available in CDP?
Yeah, so lineage is very important, right? As customers think about like building these data lake platforms, and also as you're onboarding data from on-prem to cloud, being able to actually trace it all the way from the on-prem source systems to the cloud is something that we provide. So we manage lineage in an active way, which means as you do things with the data set in the data lake environment, we capture lineage and we create a graph model, and then we provide a visual interface on top of it. Now, we understand that we have to be a good citizen in the enterprise data landscape because a lot of things may be done outside our control. So what we do is we provide a lineage API. So for things that are not visible to us that you may be doing outside of the data lake environment, you can actually feed us lineage so that we will augment that lineage graph so that you can see more from the left-hand side before the data came in, or also from the right-hand side once the data is extracted out of the platform into downstream systems and things like that.
Okay, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions for this session, but if you have further questions for our speakers, please
Yeah.
feel free to speak.
Yeah, and we're in booth 1115, so please stop by if you want a demo of the platform or want to talk to some of our solution architects. Thank you. Thanks for attending. Thanks, Alvin.